Hi, Shelly.
Hi.
I'm so excited to have you here on the Heart Wide Open Wellness Podcast. We've been friends and colleagues and support systems for one another for many, many, many years now. Yeah, Shelly and I met, we kind of crossed over right behind each other at an eating disorder clinic decades ago. And
Mhm.
yeah, I was doing my traineeship. I was just a brand new therapist in the world and doing learning a whole new industry, and eating disorders was something that we both had a heart to serve and have continued serving over the years. So I know you've taken that a step further, but I will get into your formal bio. But Shelley's just informed and just all around good human. So I think just more importantly, she's a good person. And so I'm just really happy to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to
Yes.
be here.
So let me get right into your professional bio a little bit, just
Okay.
so everybody, I know you, but so everybody knows your history a tad bit. So Shelly's been a dietitian for 22 years, specializing in eating disorders for 19 of those years, working with holistic nutrition since 2009. Holistic nutrition includes getting to the root cause of conditions to support healing instead of simply managing the symptoms. Shelley's extensive experience in nutrition therapy for the varying degrees of dysregulated eating and feeding issues has been her focus. This can range from occasional emotional eating to severe eating disorders. Her passion is assisting others in increasing health and restoring natural eating cues using a mind body approach, thus creating a more balanced relationship with food and overall well being. What else does the audience need to know about you, or is there anything else you would like to add to that?
Well, let's see. Yeah, I've worked in all levels of care as far as eating disorders go, from actual medical hospital to the 24/7 residential care to partial hospitalization, which is, basically every day a week, but you go home at night. The intensive outpatient, which is a few hours a day, for a few days a week, depending on the program. And then I currently am actually an outpatient, which is my preferred place because we get to do the long-term work. We do the acute care, but we also do the long-term restoration of, like you mentioned, the natural feeding cues and getting people back to their more intuitive state of eating. And so I'd like to be in there, with people for the long haul. Um, and That's why I left the clinics a number of years ago so I could solely focus on outpatient.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So what is your situation now? So you currently are in El Dorado Hills and California,
Yes.
and what is the capacity as to how people can work with you? Because I know they're going to get to that. So let's just get that. What do you offer currently?
So I am in office 2 days a week and I do telehealth 4 days a week, basically. So telehealth, um, people can live anywhere they need to, and there's ways we can, do the medical component of things if we need to, ways we can do some of the other pieces that we would typically do in person, but we can still do or excuse me, on the virtual setting.
Right. And you've been doing that in that capacity for quite a while. So I know that you
Yes.
feel very confident in being able to meet the needs to the level that you need to in both.
Yes.
So fantastic.
hmm Yes. Yeah. Ever since the beginning, I did, telehealth. And when, I'd have patients that would go off to college, I'd still continue seeing them in their college. So we would do, phone calls, video calls, those kind of things, starting, way back when in 2009 when I opened up my practice.
Great. So, let's get right in then. So, I
Okay.
know in regards to emotional eating, binge eating, eating disorders, those are probably some of the things that we'll talk about today. So, could you explain the differences between emotional eating, binge eating, and eating disorders?
Sure. So the lines are a little bit grayed, but there are definite differences between the three. So, emotional eating is very much a part of eating disorders. But I would say, when someone comes in with emotional eating, it's basically like emotions are typically running the food behaviors, but it's not as the thought pattern's not as aggressive. It's not attached to a lot of other um, situations, and it's because essentially all humans are wired to have emotional connections to food. And it's not intended to be dysfunctional. However, our mind unfortunately can turn it into a dysfunctional coping mechanism, basically. So the emotional eating, there's a level of the coping mechanism to it, but I wouldn't say it, like I said, it's not as aggressive as, say, disordered eating and binge eating are. So the disordered eating, there's different criteria, that you could find online, but it is basically when, there's a number of different eating disorders too, anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disordered, ARFID, which is a sensory feeding issue. And that is more, the thought patterns are kind of all day long, and they really interrupt any kind of natural eating cues. So there's not a lot of, so basically there's not really peace around food when it's disordered. There's a lot of dialogue in the mind around, good or bad food. Should I eat this? Should I not? It's too many calories. What is it? It's all the different judgments around food. And so eating disorders are very much, that's how we categorize them, where it's kind of day in, day out, not really, you don't really get a huge break from the thought patterns. A lot of times I ask my patients, like, what percentage of the day do you notice eating sort of thoughts? And it's, generally typically greater than 50%, if not 100 in some of the more severe cases. So, and that could be anywhere from, complete underfeeding to, excessive overfeeding, like in binge eating disorder. So the binge eating disorder is, we kind of look at it as it's large amounts of food, typically in short amount of time, and there are not compensatory behaviors, which there are in, say, bulimia. Not to say that there isn't a little bit of like, oh, okay, I ate too much last night, so I'm not going to eat this morning. But it generally involves not having any compensatory like exercise or purging, any of those type behaviors, with like after the binge.
Mhm.
And it's kind of like it just ends up being a large amount of food, whether it's short amount of time or it can be, say, getting home from work and binging the rest of the evening. So that's often a pattern that's seen as well. So again, the lines are a little bit gray, but there also are some distinctions of each of the different categories.
Okay.
So if we do try to, the whole idea is that we get the emotions to release essentially from the food, which is why it ends up being a long-term process.
Okay. And so if somebody is listening and they're thinking, well, I think about these things here and again, it for them to understand, not that they should self-diagnose, but to
Mhm.
understand, have greater understanding, it's really the volume. So if you're just having a thought here and there, or I shouldn't last night was a little bit excessive or whatnot, that's not necessarily what we're talking about. That could be in the vein of emotional eating, and it could just be not, but it's
Right.
if we're looking at an eating disorder, a binge disorder, anorexia into one of the DSM categories, then again, could you just repeat the percentage of thinking? Because I think people would really value, like, it maybe, and maybe even just speak to what those thoughts might be, and how you see people deal with those.
Sure. Yeah. So, some level of overeating can be considered normal. Like, let's say you go to a barbecue and there's appetizers and there's food, and then it's a birthday party too. So, and there's dessert. So, you can overeat at that and it's not considered an eating disorder. It's not even considered binge eating. It can be, yeah, because I had too much food last night. It was a fun party. And that's kind of the end of it. Then the mind's like, yeah, maybe a lot of times people aren't thrilled with having done that, but it really doesn't go into this whole kind of, chain of thoughts from there. Overeating, randomly here and there is not considered necessarily problematic. It's when there is like an emotional pull towards it, and when there are suppressed emotions, which oftentimes people aren't aware that there are suppressed emotions, when the suppressed emotions kind of are constantly driving the desire to eat or thoughts of food, or food rules are created, things like that, that ends up taking up at least 50% of the thought patterns around food, typically more than that is what I see. um, where basically there's not really a meal that is considered okay unless it sort of conforms to a diet meal, and then that's okay, in the mind basically. And that's when it's kind of like good versus bad, and everything goes into a category that is definitely more of a dysregulated eating pattern, especially when it is really connected to emotions and, coping mechanism piece, which is ultimately what eating disorder is, a coping mechanism. you know Emotional eating randomly here and there is not necessarily into the coping mechanism category, but definitely eating disorders are.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
my work with working with individuals who've had eating disorders is really the heightened is the thinking, the preoccupation with
mhm,
really beating yourself up and having very negative
yes,
self-image, negative view of yourself, but then also just really being hard on yourself, just to a
yeah,
degree that's it can make you really withdraw from life and
mhm,
withdraw from relationship, withdraw from things that really matter to you, uh,
right.
and it really take the joy out of life in many ways. So,
Definitely, yeah, a lot of shame and guilt associated with it, a lot of judgment, um, and a lot of times it's attached to, like, the food behavior equals who I am as a person,
mm,
or their value, because I overate last night or I did this, then I must not be a good person, basically it's attached to, who you are as a person. A
right.
lot of times the mind will do that.
Even yes, I'm not worthy. And even now I need to punish myself, like because of last
Yes.
day or last night, I don't deserve to have a good day today or tomorrow. Like I need to,
Mhm.
almost taking yourself out because
Yeah.
a lot of rigidity. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of thoughts of like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I stop doing this? Those
Mhm,
kinds of things.
mhm. Okay. Yes. And we will explore some ideas of how to work with these, but also just that if there is somebody listening that does have a predominant amount of these thoughts on a recurring daily basis, that is the point when it is time to look for help or to start to address that.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for just breaking those down a little bit.
You're
So,
welcome. Mhm.
how do we get control over food back if we lose it in one of these processes?
Yeah, so the word control is a lot of times the word that is used, but I don't necessarily like that because the idea is that we're not controlling food when we're in, eating disorder recovery. It's the word is used because eating disorders feel out of control, whether it's out of control in restrictive behaviors or it's out of control in overeating behaviors. So ultimately it comes down to what are the reasons why this is happening? What are the emotions? What are the situations and emotions that our mind decides to use eating disorder as a coping mechanism? So we have to get to the root of these. Um, we have to get to the root of these issues to be able to, for the mind to be able to get back to a place of regulated eating. Because once it gets to the eating disorder state, it's essentially wrapped in there in the mind pretty tight, and we have to do a lot of unraveling to um, teach our mind that we can do the emotional piece without food.
Mhm.
Because there's a part of our mind that assumes that once eating disorder is in there, that's all we have. That's our primary and most effective coping mechanism. When ultimately it actually is not. But the mind is really it's really strong in its belief that food is the answer or lack of food, say in anorexia. But basically eating behaviors are what are going to keep us safe, what are going to manage the emotions. And it's not necessarily a conscious thought either. A lot of it's the unconscious, drive to undereat or drive to overeat. And so as we work through a lot of the underlying reasons why and find other coping mechanisms that work and ways to find peace around food and find joy in all of those things, our minds then are able to start to unravel and disconnect from food. However, we really have to show in many different ways and many different types of situations that we know how to navigate these situations emotionally without the use of food or lack thereof. So it's quite a long pattern of unraveling the coping mechanism and using different ways of self-care, different ways of um, navigating the different emotions that cause it in the first place and understanding too. A lot of times I describe to my patients, our brain has to understand the emotions because if they're just swirling around without any label to them, so to speak, we don't really know what to do with that. And so with that, then we sort of auto divert over to food or lack thereof. And that's what takes on the emotion regulation is the eating behavior, and then becomes more of a primary focus. So we shift off the actual problem and emotion onto the food behavior.
Okay.
So again, as we start to learn how to do things differently and um, letting go of the dieting mentality, letting go of the good food, bad food, all those type things, our mind is willing to let it go, but it really has to have substantial amount of proof to let go. And as that letting go takes place, that's when we don't feel out of control with food or out of control with restrictive behaviors anymore as it starts to unravel. So that's why the process takes so long.
Yes, I was just going to say, so the unraveling takes, it's in there pretty deep and it takes a long
Yes.
time to undo it. So
Yes.
that's just very indicative that it takes some time and and some consistency to undo what has been done. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
And then I wanted to just add to for coping mechanisms, to be clear, to define what that is. So a coping mechanism, and please add to what I don't include here, but in the work that we do, the coping mechanisms can be healthy or unhealthy, and they can be
Yes.
healthy for a duration of time. They can serve
Mhm.
for a duration of time, and then often they expire. So this is why we have to be very mindful and in tune with where we're at in our levels of whether it's recovery or just working through an issue that we're dealing with. That something that may basically a coping mechanism, it comes into place when we are in a place of challenge or struggle and we rely on something to help us and to kind of buoy us in that time frame. So, example, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling lonely, I didn't get invited to the party, I'm home by myself on a Friday night. I find comfort in food and just maybe excessive television binge watching, and those are my current coping skills to get through that evening. And maybe here and there that could be okay because it was better than maybe some alternative option, but that on a repetitive basis becomes ingrained in my neural pathways, ingrained in my thinking that now whenever I'm sad and lonely, I need to isolate and overeat to be able to get through this. And so you have to
Right.
teach yourself when you're undoing that, you remove the food, you remove the addictions piece of possibly the TV, and then the food. But if we're talking about the food here, then you have to learn to sit with that sadness and that loneliness, and find either different coping skills and or just learn to sit with it, right? And I'm married,
Right.
but that's what just that's is there anything else you would add to for what a coping skill is, and how you see it show up?
Yeah, a lot of times how I describe it is once eating disorder is in there, our mind is pretty convinced that that's the most effective. And it's not, we usually have to have, kind of describe, we just have to have a bunch of maybe smaller coping mechanisms that synergistically can sort of take the place of food.
Mhm.
Usually, especially in the earlier phases of recovery, the mind always feels like food is the best. So maybe we try five other things, and five of those things together maybe kind of got close to how well the food is perceived to work. Um, so it's basically knowing that it may not feel as good as the food does in those very short minutes of food actually feeling like it works. So a lot of times I have people make a coping list or like a distraction list of think of everything possible you could do besides eat or everything possible you could do besides restrict. And so I'll say categorize it into things that need to be done, things that you want to get done, fun things, silly things, and just make a list of all of those different things and categorize them so that when you're in that moment of whether it's wanting to restrict your food or wanting to overeat your food, you have a bunch of things present visually available to you to try a number of these things to hopefully prevent engaging in the food behavior. Sometimes someone will do five things and it works great. Sometimes they do 10 things, it doesn't work at all. It's something that you practice over time that eventually all of these other things can take the place of food and they actually are productive and good for us, whether it's, something we need to get done or it's good for us emotionally to do so. So it does take a lot of practice in doing these, but I like to tell people to to put a list on their phone or write it out and put it on the fridge, because when we're in those moments of severe distress and around food and emotions, we can't really necessarily think of what's available to us for a coping mechanism. So if it's actually something we can visually look at, it is easier to say, okay, I'm going to try this, this, and this today. And then if that doesn't work, maybe I'll try a few more things. That doesn't work, well, maybe this is not going to work tonight, or maybe it works great. Or maybe we just get enough of our own, strength to override the eating behavior urge.
Yes. Yeah.
So the coping is pretty broad, and we look for obviously healthy coping mechanisms and things that can take the place of the food behavior.
So as you're doing that, I know you have information to share about why are certain, so you do this, you're trying to increase basically flexibility in your coping skills, like be able to one, identify when you're in that spot that you are using a coping skill, and then
Mhm.
use an alternative, productive or useful, beneficial choice. And then you're now sitting with that emotion that is underneath, or the possibly a trauma, possibly whatever could be coming underneath that has caused you to use the coping skill to begin with. Why is it that certain emotions are, or I'm sorry, certain emotions, certain foods are harder to manage than others, like are more addictive, are harder to kick, so to speak?
Well, a lot of it is because they've become, in our repertoire of coping. So
Mhm.
we can seek certain foods. A lot of times sugars are definitely in there. Processed foods are typically in there. Number one, there's a chemical component to a lot of these foods that have an addictive piece to them. There's certain additives, certain flavors that are essentially addictive. And then the other part is usually is a food that we wouldn't normally eat in our day to day, or it's been labeled as bad, or it's been labeled as high calorie or a problematic type food. Those are the ones that the mind assumes are going to be more powerful in the coping mechanism. So don't really binge on carrots, but if we don't let ourselves have cupcakes ever, that's going to be that can often be the choice, because we have a green light essentially in those moments when we're in a lot of distress, and maybe when the emotions have settled, we don't want to have those foods anymore, or they were labeled bad, or those kinds of things. So um and certain foods can be associated with, say, traumas, and something that was used for coping during a traumatic situation oftentimes stays that coping food until we are able to release it. So say if a certain food brought safety and comfort as a child, it oftentimes stays in that same comfort and safety place as an adult, even though the food is now causing distress, and the person doesn't want to be eating anymore. There's still a piece where our psyche says, this is safe, let's do this food. So a lot of times we have different parts of our brain combating the certain food. One part saying eat this food, the other part saying no, I don't want to be eating this food, and we usually are eating that food anyway because it's so deeply attached to different situations in life, or a different category of food, whether it's like sweets, or sometimes it's just chips in general. Can be any kind of chip as well. That category of this food is attached to my perceived safety.
Hmm. Hmm.
So a lot of times it's the deep rooted emotions that our mind is assuming that the food will provide safety with.
Okay. So then people, what do they do with that? They say, well, I've never, hot tamales is my thing that I go to, right? Or red licorice, or, these are common things. They're candy or cookies or whatever that people get kind of addicted to as a safety food or as a comfort. So how long does it take to really get over that? And then you eliminate that. And then initially, I guess this question first. So if you identify it's hot tamales and you put in, most people overcompensate when we try to fix a problem, we go to the extreme other end. So now I'm going to have no hot tamales,
Mhm.
only spinach and carrots for the next 20 days, right? And of course, that doesn't work. But
Right.
could you speak to a little bit about kind of the consequence of that yo-yo dieting, and how dieting either contributes to dysregulated eating habits or if it is useful in any way?
Okay. So yeah, let's just take the hot tamales for example. So if our mind has deemed that hot tamales are safe, They're the food that provides comfort. They're what is utilized in these heightened emotional states. If we say no more hot tamales, what that does is it creates deprivation, and it also can create a sense of lack of safety. So that becomes a very uncomfortable and a highly ineffective way to navigate an attachment to hot tamales. Because when the primal brain perceives deprivation, not that we have to have hot tamales to survive, but the primal brain says, what if I did? What if I needed these hot tamales to survive when I was in desert? That's all that's available. Well, now we've created a dangerous situation, and that does not work to pull it out because we never get past the connection to hot tamales when we say no more hot tamales. So oftentimes, depending on the person, we find different ways of incorporating them in, bringing hot tamales to a neutral place where they have no attachment to them,
Mhm.
and that works better than saying no more hot tamales ever. Sometimes we may say don't have that at home, maybe have them say like buy a box and bring it to work and that's it for the day versus like buying a bunch and having it at home. So we sometimes change the environment where we have the food to kind of break up the patterning of it. But as far as dieting goes, so dieting itself reduces the caloric intake, right? And instead of that working long term, the body adapts to the lower calorie from a place of survival and adaptation. So when we do reduce our calories, we can lose weight initially, but that will ultimately stop um, because the primal brain is assuming that we are now starving or in a very low food type situation. And so we metabolically have to adapt to that because we can't be operating at the same speed we were before when there's less food because that doesn't work for survival. And so when the primal brain is very much a part of eating disorders, and so when it's activated, we have to calm that piece down and teach the mind that there is no lack of food, there is no deprivation, and so instead of saying there's no bad foods, I like to say let's bring all foods neutral.
Mhm.
And then from there we can decide how we want to eat way down the road and what works better for us. But in the earlier stages, we bring things to neutral because that actually allows the mind to settle around any of its perceived notions around the foods, perceived notions around the safety of foods, um, and being able to, we have to have enough food in our body to be able to stop either of or any of eating disorder behaviors. So whether it's too little food, um, that leaves us susceptible to whether it's binge behaviors or just continued restrictive behaviors. And our brains don't really work very well when that's going on because we're in place of adaptation versus thriving. So we do have to restore a natural and proper amount of food to be able to get to the place of recovery and letting the emotional piece go. Because our physiology really is the primary concern. Our primal brain says our survival is the most important.
Yes.
Our mood is not important at all.
Yes.
So we have to really balance the food and the proper amounts of food for our minds to be able to get to a place of recovery,
Okay. So
which is why dieting does not work.
correct, correct, correct. And I just will add it. And I think I love hearing from you and then being able to kind of feed it back from the mental health perspective, right? You're coming from the dietary and biological perspective, and then and kind of giving that the round form because that's what we do here with that holistic approach. So something that comes up for me when, and I know you know this, but I just add to that the amygdala, right, is our emotional response system. It kind of just like it's the one that fight or fight and runs and responds. It also, some of the studies have shown that, if you have, let's say you have hope and joy and optimism, like as you're really in a state of those, but then you've got those as your top three, and then fear is your fourth kind of thing that you have going on in your amygdala. Your body, based on that survival thing that you just said, fear will say, I take all of you, and it will jump to the front. So it's really challenging if fear is in there at all. So it makes a lot of sense that if you are inducing something that's like, if I can't have this, like I'm scared if I can't have my security blanket, hot tamales are my security blanket. If I can't have that, then fear, even if you're feeling optimistic about your new approach to food or hopeful about this new approach to food, that fear, if it's in there, it will jump forward, and then you just induce the whole stress hormone and you're back into the negative way of thinking and you've dysregulated your whole nervous system again. So just feeding it back again from just that angle and making sense of exactly what you just said. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that what you're just describing creates a very, very strong urge to eat hot tamales, like almost
Right.
an undeniable urge to eat them.
Right.
So the strategy does not work. Yeah, when we induce that fear, we have to really settle that fear down with food in general to be able to detach from it emotionally.
When you're dieting, that extreme state, you're actually rewarding a stress-induced system, right? Because you're losing weight by that initial stress and
Right.
strain, and then almost reinforcing that that is a good thing versus, in my opinion, the neutrality. Another word could be just balance or emotional regulation, or just being in a new lifestyle adaptation, a new lifestyle living would be. You're not that is almost I don't want to say boring, but it's like you're actually reinducing like the addiction to the stress of the
Right.
diet. Yeah.
Yep, that's right. And also there's a part to the human body where it knows that lack of food can have a numbing effect on emotions. So we have this unconscious connection to underfeeding as well because of the dulling of emotions based on the survival mechanisms kicking in
Yeah.
and the emotions having to be doled out. So there is a reward system in that as well.
Right. And just to speak to that, so we use food to in a binge capacity to kind of solace or soothe in many, and I know this is a broad brush stroke and there's more details to this, but
Right.
in general, the binge and the eating, the consumption is more soothing, and then the restriction is soothing in a different way because it's kind of basically making the biochemistry of the body unable to feel, right? And then like
Correct. Yes.
building the cognitive ability so you don't have to process the things you don't want to think about and you don't have to feel the things you want to think about. So both are effective, but for different reasons and different soothing aspects.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So kind of a two-part question and take it how you will. So we talked a little bit about how do you think how long does it take to kind of get control back or to heal from food issues? And I guess let's start there. How long does it take to really heal from these kinds of things?
Well, it's very individualized. We typically say plan to commit to at least a year.
Mhm.
And oftentimes we're just getting some stability back by a year. So typically it can, it's rare that I see it a year, but we always tell people give it a year and then, we have to keep going. You know, sometimes it's a couple, sometimes it's 7 to 10. There's so many different variables, different capacities in everybody. And so it is a lengthy process, absolutely worth it. And we're not typically when I tell people we're not struggling because they in year one, we're not typically struggling the way we are in year one, say in year three. There's still maybe a number of eating disorder thoughts and behaviors going on, but it typically is to a lesser degree. And there's been tremendous amount of progress and a lot of information gathered. So the mind is on its way to shifting away from it, but sometimes it still has, quite a hold on it emotionally.
Right.
So it's really hard to say how long, but it's definitely worth it to go there for the long haul because it does allow for peace around food and peace around our body and just returning back to eating cues. So it really doesn't take a lot of thought once we're at the end of the recovery journey. So it's worth it. It just takes longer than most people prefer it to.
Right. So I'm imagining you get people at all kinds of stages of maybe they're in a little bit of denial, but they're there because I don't know, maybe somebody told them they need to be there, or or the other extreme where they're completely in and they are ready, they're done with the pain of the disordered eating and they're ready to fix it. And
Right.
so I'm imagining that that also is direct correlation to what, a year or more versus, of course, it's going to take a year or more. I mean, I can imagine. And so,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, because sometimes people come to me having done a tremendous amount of work already. So maybe we're just working on fine tuning some of the residual eating disorder things that are going on, residual thoughts, residual behavior. So sometimes it may not take quite as long because they've already done a lot of work.
Yeah.
Or people come to me from the absolute very beginning. So that's when we look at taking a longer time period for that. So
Mhm. This is I know this is a very specific question and not something that we've talked about a lot, but do you see what is the, I guess maybe shockingly easiest part for your patients, and then what is maybe the most challenging thing that they come in and go, "Oh, I didn't think that would be so hard," or "I didn't think that'd be, I didn't think I'd get that," or do you see anything like that?
let's see. That's kind of a tricky question. I would say the hardest part is, say, from an anorexia perspective, is typically the refeeding when
Hmm.
we're basically reestablishing proper amounts of food, um, which can take quite some time because there's a lot of things that go on metabolically in the refeeding process. So that I feel is the hardest piece from an anorexia standpoint. From, say, more of a binge eating type standpoint, the hardest part is finding something else to do besides binge.
Yeah.
Finding those distraction techniques and different coping mechanisms, that is really hard because, a lot of times there is a lot of white knuckling that has to take place, but the ideas are not white knuckling forever, just how I describe it. So something that people find as they go through their process, a good amount of eating disorder thoughts just disappear and kind of dissipate. So that I would say is one of the easier things is as we're working on this over here, the mind is letting go of some of the food thoughts over here. So some things just kind of dissipate that we thought would be harder to work on. They actually kind of left because we worked on something else, typically the emotions and the other coping. So sometimes things actually get easier working on something that appears separate, but it's actually very connected. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like, oh, wow, I haven't thought about food in 3 hours. That's strange, because it was 24/7. So I see things like that too, which make it for us is very rewarding when we see things kind of just stabilize basically by working on something else.
Yeah, that makes sense too, because you were working on the root issue. So when you are working
Yes,
on the root issue, you pull that root, it's everything connected to that is going to just by default magically be, oh, that's got
right,
fixed now in the process too. So
right.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
the usefulness of your approach for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah. I always like to provide hope because maybe, this is a lot of information. Perhaps somebody's listening that is in the position where they are reaching out or they're in the beginning stages of deciding that that is what they should do. So when you do start to see progress with, let's do go each extreme, the binge eating and then the anorexia, the restricting, what are some of the comments or the ahas or the what are the hopeful statements that come in on either side? What do people say that, what do they enjoy about life again? What is positive for them? What are they able to reestablish in their life that you see as a kind of a trend?
So a lot of times what I hear kind of between all ends of the spectrum is the reduced focus on food behaviors, the reduced focus on body, getting more peace around food situations, say going to birthday parties are not stressful anymore because the food piece doesn't have as much of a grip. And so being able to do the day to day and social things that are intended to be fun are not stressful anymore, or they're maybe 50% less stressful, which is a huge reduction in stress around, food situations. So a lot of times it's just the day to day, just not being plagued as much by food thoughts all day long. We're actually able to think about other things that matter versus always auto diverting over to food and food behaviors. So that is one thing that people experience on a regular basis, in the recovery process, which is really rewarding to get a break and see that the work that they have done is what created that break.
Yeah, I mean,
So, yeah,
ruminating thoughts can be so preoccupying, right? They take all of your energy,
absolutely.
all your focus, and then you can't
Yeah.
attend to what you really love. So you have space
Yep.
to do
Yeah.
what's important to you again. So
Yeah.
that makes
And getting connect. Mhm.
So do you believe that someone, if they implement the tools, both that they receive from external sources and the ones that they have not been listening to within themselves, because they are their own guide in many capacities, we know. Do you think someone can completely recover from an eating disorder or a lifelong pattern of emotional eating?
I do. I feel like if we are able to get to the root, and that doesn't mean we have to be perfect at processing emotions and be great at every single thing we do, but I feel like if we are able to attend to the emotions underneath and at least have more skills in processing the behaviors, or excuse me, processing the emotions and being able to tune back into our own feeding cues, hunger, fullness, and just the satiety center that we need to be able to reach when the brain says, okay, I've had enough. So, as we're able to do all of those things, I do feel like people can fully recover from an eating disorder. We do stay, I feel like, in a fragile period for quite some time where we always have to be on it and making sure that we're not letting any of the sneaky thoughts or any of the sneaky behaviors in. But that I feel like that is the time period that passes too, where we're able to, whatever life may bring us, the mind doesn't automatically say, well, now we do the eating disorder again. So we can get to a place over, however many years that is, we can get to a place of full recovery where we've taught ourselves that entire time that the eating disorder is not what we use for coping anymore.
Mhm.
So, um, but again, we have to be willing to sit in that discomfort, like you mentioned earlier. We have to be willing to at least understand some of the all the emotions around why the coping mechanisms there in the first place. So education, I feel, is one of the primary things that's necessary in in the recovery process, which I provide, to my patients, education of what's going on, why it's going on, why the mind is repeating this information, why it's connected to this. All of the different pieces are important to understand, and that creates a much greater capacity for full recovery, is
Yes.
being able to look at all the parts.
Yeah. I really appreciate that you said that there's a fragile period. I can't imagine that there wouldn't be. The thing is that when we make a major change in ourselves, we quite literally change who we are at some capacity. We change our identity. We're now not that person that goes to the party and does ABC. We are not that person that stays inside on 7 days a week. We are not that person that does
Right.
things or relies on these coping skills. So you're in essence a different person. And so there's internal and external changes that come with that, right? Like maybe you do
Mhm.
change some of who you hang out with or what you do on the weekends, or and so learning to accept and give grace to yourself in those new environments and learn how to do the new thing is, yeah, it takes some time. Any big
Right.
change, you're basically
Hmm.
a different way.
Definitely. Yeah, we have to teach our minds not to autopilot to the eating disorder and everything that goes along with it. So we can teach it with the neuroplasticity, which is how we can change our thought patterns and all that. We are able to, that is why we can recover from an eating disorder. The brain has the ability to do, has a capability basically, and because of that is why we can recover. So we're teaching new thought patterns, we're teaching new food patterns, new ways of listening to our hunger and fullness signals and satiety. So as we teach all of these new patterns, the structure of the brain as opposed to the eating disorder thoughts.
Mhm. Yes. And so it goes. It could happen again and again and again because you teach the next layer to get a little
Yes,
process, and then you might need to upgrade that.
right.
And yes.
Absolutely.
And so also, I think encouraging for somebody that might be struggling that there's uh, that the food part or the lack of food part is only so long that once you manage that, I mean, granted, that could take slower or longer for an individual depending on different circumstances and situations, but that once getting through the food, there is, and I know that relapse is a thing as well, but that there's a next stage that there is, and almost something what that's encouraging, right? You climb the rungs on the ladder, right? You get over,
Right.
and then you start to move into more of the behaviors, and then you move more into the thoughts, and then you move more into, or just that there's different stages, and it isn't so recovery from an eating issue isn't about the eating the whole time. There's different stages of the eating recovery is what I'm kind of trying to line out.
Right. Yes, definitely. It oftentimes feels a lot better because people are not plagued by the food or food thoughts and the behaviors and whatnot. They've dramatically reduced, if not eliminated, and now we're just working on the residual. parts of their mind that need attending to.
Right. They almost have distance from it in a sense.
Yes.
Okay, that's fantastic. What do you see as useful in that secondary phase? You know, you've managed the food to a certain degree. You're still kind of paying attention, right? You're not so that you're cautious, but you're in more of the behavior change, the implementation of lifestyle change, and thought, working on the thoughts. What do you see as really useful to patients at that in that span?
From well, from my standpoint as a dietitian, we work a lot on the feeding cues. What that means is hunger, fullness, and satiety, which are not often very strong signals, and they are meant to be able to be ignored completely for survival mechanisms. So kind of like feast or famine, where we have to override our our natural cues if we're in that kind of situation, say ancestral line, those kind of things. Um, then it becomes what we work on a lot is being able to recognize hunger. How do you recognize hunger when you have a lot of anxiety? Anxiety is a hunger suppressing type situation because fight or flight, cortisol, all of those things reduce our hunger and if not eliminate it entirely. And so we have to be able to recognize what is our hunger coupled with a tremendous amount of anxiety or even just a little bit of anxiety. We have to be able to identify hunger and then identify fullness too in a very vague kind of situation. We can recognize really severe hunger. We can recognize a dramatic, overfeeding. But a lot of times the ones in between are really hard to capture. Have I had enough food? Did I have too much? I'm not sure. Can't really tell. And a lot of people don't even get stomach hunger in general. They feel it more in like tiredness or kind of a hangry feeling or feel more in their extremities, like feel weaker, but the stomach isn't really communicating a lot. And so we can't say, well, is your stomach hungry? Then eat. We can't use that all the time. So we have to be able to determine what are our own body messages around feeding. And so we spend a lot of time practicing all kinds of different situations and assessing them to be able to determine, okay, what is our body telling us around food? And being able to interpret something that is not necessarily this red light, green light.
Yeah.
Hungry, green light, full, red light. It's kind of like, I think I'm full, not sure. So it's a lot of it's practicing,
Mhm.
and being able to have the flexibility of let me just see how this works. And also using the mind to, well, I have this particular work schedule, so I have to eat here even if I'm not hungry because I can't eat for another 3 hours. So learning how to feed with a schedule and learning how to feed with our own cues and how do we mix that together. So it's basically the body's communicating, but the mind is the helper. That's kind of how I describe it. And we spend a lot of time restoring the natural cues because dieting, dysregulated eating, eating disorders in general completely disrupt the feeding mechanism. So we have to restore them, and that can take some time.
I absolutely every single thing you just said in the last couple of minutes is just, I think, so useful and insightful. And I think just you lining it out like that, I think those are the real struggles is how do I eat on this job? How do I'm never hungry. So how do I do this? And like
Hmm.
not even acknowledging that that is a repercussion of anxiety. I mean, I think there's some people that don't even realize they have anxiety to that degree, right? So it's just
Right.
all of this information can initially maybe be overwhelming, but it's useful. And if you don't know what's happening, it's like those, if you don't know where to start, you can't fix it. So you have to just,
Right.
and having the support of somebody who understands the real life challenges of implementing new behavioral change and having as a support system along the way, it makes a lot of sense. I would also I know you are an advocate of this, but because this is the environment that we met in was where there was part A is doing the dietitian work, part B is doing the therapeutic work. I would even say that there's possible physical work, whether that be, yoga or working out or walking or, just, but really learning how to be in your body, being in
Yes.
community, not doing it alone and injuring kind of those isolation tendencies or re-festering those isolation tendencies. A lot, yes, a lot of these things seem that they would be the next layers too of the what's needed.
Right. Definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a whole mind body approach to be able to fully recover. We have to have all the pieces working together
Yeah.
because the eating disorder really separates us
Yeah.
from our actual self. And it basically separates, mind and body. And we have to be able to bring that back together.
Yeah. And the individual, it's important that they know that they have separated themselves, and that the work is coming back not only into the wholeness of themselves, but into relationship with the world around them and the people that are in their world,
Right.
right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's a big task, and a beautiful one, I guess. A
Yeah.
beautiful opportunity. Well,
Yeah.
I know we could talk about so much more, and I'm sure we will, but thank you so much for all of that information. Is there anything today that you're feeling needs to be said that we didn't get to share today?
I feel it's important to understand that we are not powerless over food, that our minds do have the capability of restoring all kinds of natural feeding cues. It has, way of eliminating the maladaptive behaviors around food. Our culture kind of presents it as we are powerless and everything's good, bad, right, wrong, but we are able to actually tune back into what our own body is communicating and what our mind is communicating around food as well. And that no matter how dysregulated things get, I do feel we can actually get back to that more mind body intuitive eating approach.
Amazing. What does it mean to you to live with your heart wide open?
Well, I would say that to me, it means approaching life in an emotionally available way, obviously to everyone's capacity of that, and approaching with curiosity and a willingness to learn, to work on, healing, and to where we are able to kind of have that ripple effect and be able to create joy around situations and just have more peace in our life, basically.
Yeah, to be able, to grow, you have to be able to change. And I think that
Right.
it's a beautiful thing that you work in with eating disorders, because eating disorders are in and of themselves resistance to change. And you're trying
Mhm.
to, in my opinion, shine the light on change can be a beautiful thing, right? So learning,
Right. Hmm.
growing can be a beautiful thing.
Yes,
Mhm.
definitely. And like I mentioned before, the recovery process is hard, but I also find it to be an amazing process because we really get to heal, we get to appreciate ourselves, appreciate what we're capable of. So it's not all hard.
Yeah.
There's certainly hard pieces to it, but there's also pieces that are quite amazing and rewarding too.
Yeah, well, if that wasn't the truth, I don't think you'd be doing it for all these years, because you would have been,
Definitely not.
if you didn't get some value and it wasn't just rewarding to see,
Yeah.
we healers do our work to see people heal. So
Right.
yes, I know that.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we have some values that we reference, and I just love to know what stands out for you. And I know I asked you this question in advance, so it can be what you thought when you were asked initially, and or what's coming up for you now. But if you think about just optimism, gratitude as a kind of a unit, abundance and possibility, choice and radical self-ownership, or joy and happiness in the pursuit of holistic vitality, which one do you connect with most, and why?
Well, I would say I've connected to all of them at different points in my life and probably all of them at all of them simultaneously too. But currently I would say mostly with the joy and happiness pursuit of holistic vitality, just based on my life experience over the last number of years, I found that my joy had been reduced dramatically by situational things and basically spending time on myself and energy to bring back the joy that had been missing. And ultimately that then creates more holistic health and holistic vitality as we're refilling ourselves and getting that joy back, we're able to have more of that vitality. And that really helps from a holistic nutrition standpoint. The emotions are very much part of it.
Yeah. It's so important that we just do our own work as we're going along too, so that we can bring that back and
Mhm.
share as well. So I'm honored to be with you on some of these journeys.
Thank you.
Be able to return to one another and support each other as we go through
Yeah.
life. Yeah. Well, thank you, Shelly, so much for your time. Just I would love to anybody who's listening, Shelly's offered $50 off of what would it be, an initial assessment?
Hmm. Yeah. So
Okay.
that's an intake appointment. It's 60-minute long appointment.
Okay, perfect. And you
Mhm.
would just redeem that from Shelly just by simply saying that you found of her through this podcast, through the Heart Rate of Wellness podcast, and or membership. I know that those members are interested as well, and I'm sure we have more to talk about. So encouragement of anybody who is listening that if you have a specific question, if something opened the door that you think Shelly would be a really great source of information, that you're probably not alone. So to please comment in the notes and to reach out and to let us know what is of interest, what is you are working through, what you would like to hear or learn more about, and we'll absolutely do our best to make that possible. So, all right,
That's
thank you, Shelly.
Thank you for tuning in to the Heart Wide Open Wellness Podcast. For more information, subscribe to our newsletter at heartwideopenwellness.com and follow us on social media at Heart Wide Open Wellness.